Conceptual, Self-Articulation, a Neo-Hegelian perspective. And just before I invite Krassimir to speak, I'd just like to remind all of you that there won't be a philosophy research seminar next week. I'll try and give another reminder at the end, or perhaps somebody else could, just in case people join later. Anyway, over to you, Krassimir. And Krassimir will talk for about 40 minutes and then we'll have questions. Okay.
Thank you, Jen, for the nice invitation and for the nice introduction, of course. It's a great pleasure for me to have this opportunity to share some thoughts with you on basically on the link between two concepts. First, the concept of human flourishing, and the second, the concept of Bildung, reconstructed from a Neo-Hegelian perspective. Can you hear me and understand me? All right, thank you very much. So I hope to be able to make a small contribution to the clarification of the concept of human flourishing with my talk, because I think that this concept is extremely important, that the concept could serve probably as a orientation for education policy. I think that the concept of human flourishing is particularly significant for educational policy as a kind of normative orientation for it. But on the other hand, I believe that human flourishing is very far of being a clear concept. So there are very different semantic components of that concept. A lot of metaphors, a lot of association, which are linked to this word, actually, to this term, human flourishing. And I do believe that by linking the concept of or the term of human flourishing to the Neo-Hegelian story about Bildung, we can get human flourishing a little bit more clear. I'm going to share my PowerPoint presentation with you now on my screen. First, about the structure of my talk. So my first point will be actually the internal or the inherent link between human flourishing and the Aristotelian term of eudaimonia. And I believe that human flourishing is the most adequate translation of eudaimonia so far. So it is not quite correct, it's not quite right to translate eudaimonia as happiness or as well-being, because what is missing at such translations, it is the objective dimension of eudaimonia. But I'm going to discuss that point a little bit later on. Then I'm going to address the question how human flourishing has been spelled out within the realm of education policy, and especially as a ultimate goal of education policy. So in this part of my talk, I'm going actually basically to discuss Harry Brighouse' version of the term of human flourishing. And in the third part of the talk, I will be talking about the link between the human flourishing and the Hegelian concept of Bildung. More or less, I'm going to switch to the Hegelian perspective on Bildung, which is, I believe, also an approach to the term of human flourishing. And actually, the central claim of the talk in that part is that both Bildung and human flourishing should be understood as conceptual self-articulation. But self-articulation is not enough in order to describe or to catch the whole range of semantic components of Bildung, because Bildung is also situated in some everyday social practices, in the practices of interpersonal relations, and especially in the practices of material labor, according to Hegel at least. And that is why in the last part of my talk, I'm going to talk about this link between self-articulation and practical self-objectification within everyday social relations and within material work. So in the second part of my talk, in the part which is more or less dedicated to the concept of Bildung, I will present some basic claims and arguments from my book on the Neo-Hegelian concept of Bildung. The book is, as Jen stated, called Education, Self-Consciousness, and Social Action, Bildung as a Neo-Hegelian conception. Now, I'm going to my first point, human flourishing and eudaimonia. So it is very usual to translate not only in English, but also in German, eudaimonia as happiness or as well-being. And this is basically the main course of interpretation of eudaimonia, for example, in the field of the positive psychology, or in the field of the so-called humanistic psychology, but also in some parts of political philosophy and in philosophy of education as well. And I believe that with regard to this interpretation of eudaimonia, Douglas Rasmussen made a very important claim, or developed a very important argument by claiming that eudaimonia is more than happiness and more than well-being, because eudaimonia is an objective concept, or to say it in my own words, eudaimonia has a necessarily objective dimension, which is not necessarily the case with happiness or well-being. When we are talking about happiness or well-being, we are having in mind normally a purely subjective state of mind or a subjective way of living. So we are associating happiness and well-being with a kind of positive emotions, with a kind of subjective fulfillment, and so on and so on. And what is missing here is the objective side of eudaimonia. And that is why, so at least according to Rasmussen, human flourishing is a better way to translate eudaimonia. The claim here is that the concept or the conception of, or the term of human flourishing does have this kind of objective dimension or objective direction. According to Rasmussen, again, who is a Neo-Aristotelian scholar interpreting basically Aristotle, and that in that perspective, in that respect, human flourishing should be understood as both an action and an end. So first, one has to say that human flourishing is a way of living. It's not a static, but it's a dynamic entity, so to say. It's a process, actually. This is a way of living that produces and actualizes human potentials in the individual on the one hand, but on the other hand, human flourishing should be understood, according to Rasmussen, at least, as a ultimate end of human conduct. And I should say, or I should add, also as ultimate end of education and education policy. When we're understanding human flourishing as a way of living, as a kind of action, or as a complex of activities, so it is already clear that human flourishing has, so to say, a direction outwards. It's directed to the objective world. So human flourishing should be, in a final account, seen as a realization of the self in the objective world. And I believe that actually the very etymology of the word flourishing actually speaks for this kind of interpretation, because to flourish means actually to make your potentials, but also your desires and your ideals visible for the others and for oneself. So it means to get forms, visible forms, understandable forms of the components of your subjective will, to put it in very in Hegelian terms. We will see later on that, but precisely this dimension of making one's own self visible, of objectificating oneself, precisely this actually this semantic dimension of human flourishing is missing in the current discourse on human flourishing, or at least it is underrepresented in that discourse.
Krassimir, sorry, can I just interrupt you and just ask, somebody has requested whether you could turn your slides into a slideshow.
Yeah, I tried for my talk, but it wasn't possible for me. So I'm afraid that it could cause a mess. So,
I see. Okay.
So,
the alternative is, if you, it'd take too long to send them to me, then I could send them to the person who particularly needs better size things. But
not a problem. It's not a problem at all. But I hope that you are able to see and to read the slides.
I think somebody can't, because they've got some slight difficulty. But I'll send them to them afterwards. Then, okay.
All right. Okay. Sorry about that.
Sorry to interrupt you.
I wasn't able, for technical reasons, probably to turn the slide into a presentation. So, but okay, let's go further, perhaps. So, in very general terms, human flourishing should be understood as a kind of realization of the self, or the components of the self, in the objective world. Now, I'm going to switch to a more detailed account of human flourishing, precisely or specifically as a goal, as a main goal, actually, as an ultimate goal of education policy. I mean here the account developed by Brickhouse during the last 15 years or so. Actually, Brickhouse lists in his two books from 2006 and 2018 several features of human flourishing. It is not always clear which of those features are really necessary conditions or necessarily belong to the concept of human flourishing, and which are not, which of them don't have this status of necessary features of human flourishing. In some cases, there are at least some tensions or even some contradictions between the features, I think, which Brickhouse ascribes to the concept of human flourishing. But we can, I should state that Brickhouse and all actually spells out human flourishing as follows. As far as I understood it, there are two main features, main semantic dimensions of human flourishing. The first one is authenticity and autonomy. Brickhouse calls it life lived from inside. This is a quotation from Brickhouse. But the second dimension is precisely the objective one. This is the directness of human flourishing towards objective goods. Although it is not quite clear what actually objective goods does mean in that version, in that interpretation of human flourishing. And according to Brickhouse and his co-authors in the later book, there are several areas which are central for human flourishing. For example, economic productivity, democratic competence, healthy personal relationships, treating others as equals. By talking about economic productivity, Brickhouse stresses that he does not mean a kind of adaptation of the individual to the demands of the labor market, but rather about the individual being able to find her own way within the labor market. So to find that kind of activities, of economic activities, which fits to her life being lived from inside, which supports her authenticity. But nevertheless, of course, being engaged, for example, in economic activities is a kind of objectively directed action also. So I think the same applies also to treating others as equals, healthy personal relationships. I think the point here is that living an egoistic life, so to say, a life by our own self, outside of the social realm, outside of economy or politics or personal relationships, is not a kind of human flourishing. So what is required for human flourishing is not only autonomy and authenticity, but also being included in different types of social relations and social structures. A very important dimension, semantic dimension of the concept of human flourishing, according to Brickhouse, is the engagement with complex and satisfying activities which have intrinsic value for the individual. Yeah. Activities like, for example, poetry or math or whatsoever. The point here is that human flourishing presupposes the performance of certain activities for their own sake, not for instrumental purposes. What is a desideratum in this story or in this account about human flourishing is something which I already mentioned, I think. This is precisely the moment of self-articulation, if you want, or self-objectification. This is the moment of individuals' needs, potentials, desires, and ideals becoming a clear and visible form. And this is actually what Bildung is about. Bildung stems from the word Bild, image in German. So the point here is that the components of the subjective will should become visible forms, clear and visible forms for the others and also for oneself. And this is precisely actually what the concept of Bildung is about. As you can translate Bildung in that sense also as formation, as becoming, as one's own subjective components of the one's own subjectivity becoming objective forms which are visible, which are understandable for oneself and for the others. Now, so I'm going to jump from here really into the concept of Bildung according to Hegel, because I think that precisely that moment of self-articulation and also self-objectivation is at best understood when we are resorting to the Hegelian perspective, to the concept of Bildung. The concept of Bildung plays a crucial role in the entire philosophical system of Hegel. It plays a key role already in the phenomenology of the spirit, this early work of Hegel, which is actually very unclear. It's a kind of obscure work, obscure writing, but you can also see how important the concept of Bildung there is, and important for the entire philosophical system of Hegel. So it has really a founding character for Hegel philosophy in general. And here's a key place from what follows is a key quotation from the philosophy of right. By Hegel, in the philosophy of right, the concept of Bildung becomes a very clear form. Clear, of course, in the context of Hegelian thinking, which is not always quite clear. And here is actually the translation of that place on Bildung, which I believe is a key passage. And here is the paragraph 187 from the philosophy of right. And this is a very mature work of Hegel. So this passage reads in the English translation as follows: culture or education, and the translator used here culture education as a translation for Bildung, which stands in that place in the original German text. Bildung is, as we may thus conclude, in its ultimate sense a liberation, and that of a high kind. Its task is to make possible the infinitely subjective substantiality of the ethical life. In the process, we pass upwards from the direct and natural existence to what is spiritual and has the form of the universal. In the individual agent, this liberation involves a struggle against mere subjectivity, immediate desire, subjective vanity, and capricious liking. The hardness of the task is in part the cause of the disfavor under which it falls. Nonetheless, it is through the labor of education that the subjective will itself wins possession of the objectivity in which alone it is able and worthy to be the embodiment of the idea. it is extremely difficult to translate Hegel into English. I believe that the original German passage is a little bit easier to understand as the English translation. But nevertheless, I think that we can pick up from that quotation as well as from other passages on Bildung and the philosophy of right the following points. Bildung should be understood as giving an intelligible substance to the elements of one's own subjective will. On the elements of one's own subjective will, Hegel understands desires, goals, ideals. Bildung is not primarily a matter of teaching or of pedagogy, rather Bildung is inbuilt in a social process, and Bildung is triggered out by the individual's transition from the unmediated natural community of family and kinship to the modern civil society. And the modern civil society, according to Hegel, consists of actors who interact with each other as others to each other. And that is why the individual is required to articulate his interests also, but also his needs and his goals in a universal way, in a rational way, in a final account, in a conceptual way, according to Hegel. So the process of Bildung, and I add the human flourishing, presupposes thus the inclusion of the individual in her individuality in the universalistically structured community of argumentation that correlates with the civil society. In order to participate in the civil society, according to Hegel, you have to be included and you have to participate in the community of argumentation of all rational beings. And this is really a social demand. This is not a pedagogical one. So what pedagogy and teaching could does in that perspective is to support that transition and that inclusion. And Hegel himself was serving as a rector of a high school, a gymnasium, I think, and his speeches as rector of the gymnasium, the so-called gymnasium in Nuremberg, are very instructive with regard to his understanding of how teaching, how pedagogy could and should support the process of Bildung so understood. So the very important moment here is this Bildung is a kind of alienation from a natural community, from a kind of pre-conceptual community, which is built upon the ties of blood and kinship. And this alienation is presupposition, is a prerequisite for the individual being able to enter the civil society, which is, according to Hegel, a individualistic structure consisting of agents or actors who are pursuing their interests and goals, but who have to coordinate their action with each other. And in order to be able to coordinate this action in others, what you need is a kind of community of argumentation. So you have to put your the elements of your subjective will in rational terms. And that requires also, that presupposes also to provide them with arguments. Now, that is why this is my next point, and I'm referring here to my book, which I mentioned. So the kernel element of the process of Bildung, according to Hegel, is the conceptual self-articulation. And conceptual self-articulation should be understood as inferential articulation of one's own beliefs, values, and ideals. That is, this is what Robert Brandom calls commitments. And Brandom is also very instructive by distinguishing with Hegel between two main form of inferential articulation in his new book, in Brandom's new book. So the one form of inferential articulation is the determinate negation, and the other is mediation. So in order to give a conceptual form to your beliefs, values, or ideals, you have to distinguish them from their opposites, so to say. This is what actually determinate negation is about. And also you have to articulate the consequences of your beliefs, and also to articulate the premises of your beliefs, your values, and your ideals. Of course, this is a very short story, or a very short summary of the whole story about conceptual articulation, or about inferential articulation. Now, what could be the common features between, and also differences, what could be the differences between human flourishing and Bildung? Obvious common feature is the focus on individual autonomy and authenticity. And also, of course, the directness towards objectivity. But I do believe that objectivity is being spelled out in different ways in the both conceptions. So in the case of human flourishing, I think we face a kind of objectivity in the forms of a kind of interaction with objective goods, or appropriation of objective goods, or being, so to say, inclined to some kind of objective values or objective goods. In the case of the Hegelian story about Bildung, the objective goods are replaced by objective concepts, or by concepts which claim objectivity, which are in that sense a part of the objective world. And now we face a crucial problem here, a big problem. So the problem is, or the doubt is, that the Hegelian story of Bildung could be a very intellectualistic or elitist one. According to this story, people are those who are capable of conceptual self-articulation, who are capable, if you want, to give a theoretical form to their beliefs, values, desires, needs. And of course, this is a problem also with the concept of human flourishing. So what we need here is to identify a kind of practical dimension of the process of Bildung, and that is to say, we should be able to spell out conceptual inferential self-articulation also in terms of everyday social relations, and also, and this is probably the most important, in terms of material work. And I do believe that we can find some insights at Hegel also for that purpose. Hegel distinguishes explicitly between theoretical and practical Bildung, between theoretical education and practical education. And that means ultimately that self-articulation takes place also in social practices, such as, for example, intersubjective recognition. Intersubjective recognition presupposes a kind of mediation between universal norms and individual cases. So when we are talking about the recognition norm of respect, for example, you have to apply universal principles, for example, of dignity or human rights, to particular contexts and especially to individual persons. And precisely this mediation between the universal and the singular is what makes up the kernel of a concept and also of a judgment, according to Hegel. You can also identify with Hegel some forms of material work, of material practices, also as expressions of conceptual self-articulation. And also in the philosophy of right, there's a very interesting opposition between what Hegel, following Adam Smith, calls abstract and simple work, for example, the work at the assembly line on the one hand, and the work of a craftsman on the other hand. The work of a craftsman could be understood kind of not only of self-expression and self-objectivation, but also as a kind of inferential self-articulation, if you want, which is not the case with the so-called abstract work of a assembly worker, according to Hegel at least. And I want to point your attention to the word abstract here. Abstract has for Hegel a clear negative meaning. Abstract means something which is without internal differentiations. So to think abstractly means not to be able to grasp differences. And articulating differences and of course inferences in that sense. So, but articulating differences and inferences is precisely what conceptual work or what conceptual articulation is about. So I think I'm at the end of my time. I was talking for about a little bit more than 40 minutes, I think. So I should stop here. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Krassimir. That was very interesting, and I just wanted lots of examples from you as you went along, and I'm sure you'll begin to give some as people ask questions. So we've got, I think, one question at least in the chat, and it's from Antti. Do you want to ask your question that you've put in the chat? Antti Molanen.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
So I was wondering about the concept of die bürgerliche Gesellschaft in Hegel. So I understand that it means many labor markets. So it's not the political sphere. So when we